This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Unregistered is mostly supported by listeners. If you'd like to support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, you can join the Unregistered Underground at unregisteredunderground.com. Members of the Underground receive access to my private AMA sessions and to our private Facebook group, as well as discounts on Renegade University courses and events. Again, to support the show and join the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredunderground.com. We also have two special Renegade University weekend events coming up. One is in Los Angeles, the weekend of February 1st to the 3rd, and the second is in Washington, D.C., and that's March 15th to the 17th. For more information and to sign up for the Renegade University special weekends with me in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., go to thaddeusrussell.com/courses. It has come to the point where advocating for free speech qualifies you for being an unregistered guest. And I can safely attest that my guest this week, by advocating for free speech and academic freedom on college campuses, is saying things you're not allowed to say, things that are beyond the pale. He's the author of the new book, Speak Freely: Why Universities Must Defend Free Speech. This is my interview with Keith Whittington. So we're sitting in sweaty, grimy, filthy, crowded, noisy Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with the William S. Nelson Chair of Political Science at Princeton University, Keith Whittington. Is that correct?
That's close enough.
Did I get that right?
The William Nelson Cromwell professor.
What did I say?
William S. Nelson, I think.
Oh, William S.
Makes it sound more like an admiral than
Well, see, this is why I got fired from academia, because I don't even remember the titles. So this is so you drove from Princeton,
yes,
to be here today, which to me that is pretty much, I can now quit. You know, I'm done. That's the greatest honor I could ever receive. I've got a Princeton professor to drive all the way to Brooklyn to talk to me.
I'm a Texan, so driving long distances is natural.
Oh, I see. We're already cutting against the narrative here.
There you go. Right.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no. So you're here, and we're here. I'm here, and we're here to talk about your book primarily, which just came out or recently came out, called Speak Freely, which is a defense of free speech and academic freedom on campuses, or I should say, I read it at least as a call for universities to uphold the principles of free speech and academic freedom. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So why don't you, let's start here. Let's do a quick, not quick, let's do an overview of the argument.
Sure.
And then we'll get into some more specific points.
Right.
And then I want to ask you kind of about yourself and why you in particular would be making these arguments, and your background from Texas.
Sure.
You write about it a bit in the book and elsewhere, you know, being important in your intellectual development and in helping you to arrive at this place where you are critiquing what's going on campuses.
Sure.
So why don't you, your book is sort of divided into kind of four, I think, major arguments, right? Why don't you let's go over them one by one.
Sure.
And see how that goes.
Yeah. No, sounds good. So the starting point of the book is to think about what the mission of the university itself is. And so I wanted to try to ground our thinking about free speech issues on campus, not in terms of what do a bunch of lawyers and judges require us to do if we happen to be in a state university, for example, but why, for those of us who live and work on college campuses, why should we value free speech? So I want to start then trying to think about what do we value on a college campus? What's a university committed to? What's its core mission? And then what are the implications of that for thinking about free speech issues? And I take the core mission of a university as being an effort to expand human knowledge and communicate what we've learned to others. And if that's the goal, then free speech and free inquiry into difficult subjects is critical to that mission. And so then the rest of the book tries to elaborate a little bit then why free speech might be related to that mission, why we ought to value it in that kind of context, then with some basic principles laid out, start trying to think through some of the kinds of controversies that have arisen on college campuses, and then end a little bit by talking about the value of intellectual diversity on college campuses and the need for universities to not only recommit themselves to free speech and free inquiry on campus, but also recommit themselves to greater intellectual diversity on college campuses.
Okay, so that's what you think the mission should be.
Yes.
Your book seems to also suggest that it has been the mission historically of universities.
I think of recently anyway. I mean, I don't think that's where universities like Princeton University started out, for example, right? But I think from the late 19th and early 20th century to now, the mission has mostly been one of dedicating itself to trying to advance the state of human knowledge. I think if you looked at universities circa 1800, for example, they wouldn't necessarily have understood themselves in those terms. And, of course, part of my concern is if we look at universities 50 years from now, they may not understand themselves as particularly committed to that mission either.
If they don't read your book.
If they don't read the book, that's exactly right. So the fate of Western civilization hangs on how many people buy the book.
This is a pretty important interview here.
Exactly.
In case you weren't aware. So I don't buy it.
Yeah. So which part don't you buy? I mean, there's lots of places to get off the bus, given that structure of the argument. So where are you getting off the bus?
I guess, let's see. I don't. The thing I'm certainly not buying is that the mission of the universities in this country has ever been devoted to that.
Yeah.
In any real meaningful way. So you said, I think, since the 50s?
I think they sort of tried to refound themselves or found themselves for the first time in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Right.
And so, the secularization of the more religiously started institutions, the rise of land-grant institutions, they all framed themselves as being committed in no small part to the advancement of human knowledge and seeking the truth. I think you're totally right, of course, that in practice, they've often fallen short of that. But I think that's been the sort of aspiration that they've tried to hold themselves to.
So most, if not all, universities, and I think a lot of colleges too, have mission statements.
Yeah. Right?
Official mission statements.
Sure.
This is what we're here to do.
Right.
And I've read many of them.
Right.
And I taught at Columbia, which I think it had the first mission statement of the university, or one of the first. And it was certainly one of the most important ones because it was written by, get this right, I'm pretty sure it was Charles Beard during World War I. I know it was during World War I. I know that, 1919, the mission statement. The mission statement of Columbia University, which is still its mission statement, is that we will train citizens.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Not train intellectuals.
Right.
Not be a place for free and open inquiry. Not a place that will be open to any idea. But we are here to train citizens. Now, in 1919, the student body of faculty was made up of the elite.
Sure.
And it still is mostly made up of the elite. And so clearly citizens meant something very particular, which I think was, leaders.
Right.
Leaders of this country. We're here to train leaders of this country. The mission statement at the school I taught at recently, Willamette University, says something similar. I don't think there's any mention of free speech or academic freedom or open inquiry or curiosity.
Right.
Curiosity, wouldn't that be a great word to see?
Yeah, although hard to sell people on the idea we ought to have an institution committed to curiosity.
Really? Why is it?
I think it's a hard sell, right? I mean,
Why?
It's I think the truth-seeking mission of the university itself can be a hard sell, right? In part because it's it's often seen as impractical, not connected enough to the real world. What's going to be the payoff of being curious, for example? I think. And you're certainly right. I think lots of institutions have language that talks about either built in their formal statements or in kinds of documents that have arisen around those universities over time that talk about the democratic function of universities and training citizens, training leaders of a republic, and the like as well. Certainly in lots of state universities with public funding, that was part of what they self-consciously thought of themselves as doing, as trying to train future citizens. And I think that's a mission that's compatible with the truth-seeking function of a university. But you're right to suggest, I think there are sometimes some potential tensions there, and they can lead you in different directions. I'd rather try to lead them in the same direction rather than lead them in competing directions. But there are some potential tensions.
Okay. So the subsequent history of modern universities was after 1919 or so, was that it continued to be a bastion of the elite, right, until sort of the 1970s and affirmative action and the new social movements and all that, right? But certainly until the 1960s and 70s, almost everyone, including W.E.B. Du Bois, right, the first black PhD, was essentially an elite, right, in this country. I mean, Du Bois grew up in Barrington, Massachusetts, right? I mean, he was an elite guy.
No, almost by definition, given the small number of students that were going to universities at that time and the cost of going.
Right. So, and then World War II happens, and then we have the Red Scare, and then here's a big problem for your claim here, right? Of course, which I know you're aware of. We have the crackdown on internal dissidents, which basically, included even a lot of sort of New Deal liberals in some ways, but certainly anybody who was a socialist or anywhere in the communist orbit, even just a sympathizer. And I have no brief whatsoever for any of that, but clearly there was no interest in listening to their ideas. Right, in these places. Right. So, I mean, we know, you and I know, but people don't know, like professors were fired or they were simply denied tenure or denied jobs and they were kicked out. So with a lot of leftist professors or academics ended up either not teaching and just doing other things, or teaching in marginal schools in the middle of nowhere. Yeah,
and even earlier as well, right? So you mentioned Charles Beard at Columbia, and Beard winds up quitting Columbia over academic freedom issues because the board of trustees, from his perspective, is intervening too much and trying to kick out left-wing professors, and he winds up quitting, which tells you what a really successful trade book can do for you. That's because Beard had enough money that he could quit and retire to just writing books full time. But I think it's right. I mean, it's been a struggle to commit universities to that kind of mission and try to get them to fully realize that mission in practice. And sometimes it's a struggle with alumni. Sometimes it's a struggle with campus administrators. Sometimes it's a struggle with trustees and regents. Sometimes it's a struggle with students and politicians and others. I mean, there's lots of people who...
I think you left out one core constituency.
Sometimes they struggle with faculty. Yes, no, exactly.
Because they're actually the ones who pretty much determine what is said.
So although so one reason why I mention all these other constituencies as well, though, is, some of these historic struggles have been struggles against those groups, right? So I think some of the struggles in the early part of the 20th century were often about making the faculty more independent from the interventions of alumni and donors and regents and the like. I think now you're right. I mean, it's a lot, and part of my concern with the intellectual diversity on campus is a concern that I think is driven partially by faculty and their own decision making, that faculty can make a relatively homogeneous intellectual environment on campuses. They can wind up pushing out people that they find discomforting in various kinds of ways. And so there's high-minded versions of that where they're patrolling the gates of academia against slipshod research and hucksters and the like, but there's also much less attractive versions of that where they're trying to maintain groupthink and insist on conformity to a set of commitments. And I think both in this context of thinking about what's the core commitments we have for the university, but also in thinking about the nature of liberal democracy, the nature of American constitutionalism, there's often a gap between the ideas and the practice. And then one challenge is to get the ideas right. What should we be committed to, and why should we be committed to those things? And then the second challenge is how do we bring the practice closer to those ideals?
Yeah. So that kind of leads me to another reason I don't buy the argument that universities have historically been committed to free speech and academic freedom, which is that the structure of the universities in the modern era and in the pre-modern era both has militated against free speech and academic freedom and open inquiry with two things. One, accreditation. Right. The accreditation system, which now, since 1965, has actually been controlled from the top by the Department of Education and the federal government, right? So it's a monopoly, really, enforced and subsidized through student loans and federal funding of all sorts, which goes to almost every single, even private school, in major amounts. Even Princeton gets massive amounts of basically federal subsidies, right? And they control the accreditation system, the accreditation agencies within higher education who accredit places like Princeton and Columbia must be accredited by the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. Right. So, and they have all these barriers to entry, right? And so like when I founded Renegade University, was like, nope, can't get college credit because there's no way I can have dormitories and a library and 25 faculty with PhDs, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So there's that. And then the other one, which is just as important, I think, is tenure. The system of tenure. And I'm not exactly sure what your argument is on this, on tenure, but I think it's a catastrophe. I think it's the worst possible thing for what we're talking about here, for free speech and academic freedom, and for mostly for intellectual diversity, right? You're talking about how faculty have often or many times enforced groupthink or homogeneous thinking through their power, but you didn't mention why they can. Right. So like, I can't enforce any homogeneous thinking in my world, even in some ways. I mean, I suppose that within my school I can, but like I'm competing with all these other people, right? And to literally make a living, I have to compete with others. So I can't afford that. They can. They're protected through the accreditation monopoly and through the tenure monopoly from the marketplace of ideas. It's a catastrophe. So I'm willing to talk about having the universities become perhaps bastions of speech, free speech and intellectual openness. But to me, that requires not reform. It requires pretty much a wholesale revolution in which we overthrow those two. Well, I mean, we overthrow at least those two basic pillars of the institution.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and I'm a little more optimistic about the possibilities of reform. But I can understand and sympathize with those who think that you need a bigger hammer than that in order to fix the problems, because I think some of those problems run pretty deep, and I think tenure is one of those examples of that, where I think it's a double-edged sword, right? There are really valuable features of tenure that do help insulate faculty from pressure from outside forces, alumni, donors, state legislatures, and the like. On the other hand, the downside of tenure, I think there's a couple of downsides of tenure. I mean, one is that it's a shrinking set of faculty, right? And so more and more faculty wind up stuck in this sort of world of contingent labor on college campuses, and they're very vulnerable, and that has real consequences for free speech as well, right? And precisely because they're not protected. If a tenured faculty member says something people find controversial on social media, for example, you might be able to get rid of them, but it's going to be a hassle and complicated, and they may well survive it. If it's a contingent faculty member, an adjunct who says something controversial on social media, they're doomed because they can be quietly shuffled out the door. And so I think those kind of things emphasize the value of tenure from certain kinds of forces. But the downside is it does insulate and entrench faculty in ways that they can reproduce themselves over time, in ways that sometimes it can be useful, but sometimes can be very unhealthy intellectually, and it can be very restrictive on what we see. And I think from sort of a pragmatic business perspective, sometimes the concern about that is that it makes colleges insufficiently flexible, so you can't shift people out of fields of study that seem like they're passé or no longer very interesting and shift them into things that seem more important. So universities can't turn on a dime to reflect sort of new kinds of concerns that might arise. But likewise, internally, it can have this kind of problem of faculty replicating themselves and hanging on to jobs when as you say, they're no longer competing in the same way for in the competition of ideas. I think even tenured faculty are still competing in some ways. I mean, they're competing for readership, they're competing for student interest, they're competing for influence. So I don't think that
they don't have to. I mean,
they don't have to,
and a lot of them don't. A lot of them,
and some,
right?
And some certainly
in my
not.
experience, many don't seem to care.
No, that's certainly right. No, that's certainly right. I mean, but of course, at that level, there's some who don't care about what I take to be the higher mission of the profession in general, which is this concern of pursue the truth the best you can and try to communicate it. Instead, for some, there's no doubt that certainly for some, tenure becomes an opportunity to find ways of sloughing off and not working very hard and pursuing other things that you find more enjoyable. And I think actually universities ought to crack down harder on that and try to insist that faculty not abuse their position in that regard. And that is one genuine problem of tenure, but I think it's potentially a separable problem from the problem of intellectual isolation and homogeneity that can also, I think, be a feature of tenure. I'm not entirely sure getting rid of tenure will fix that problem. Getting rid of shared governance might fix that problem in some ways, because it's still the case that faculty are
Just explain what shared governance is.
Yeah, so universities have long been committed to the notion that faculty ought to be the primary governing entity within universities, which means that they ought to be making hiring decisions for future faculty. They ought to be making the promotion decisions on who to keep and promote on the faculty. And they ought to make larger governing decisions about how the university operates, although that in particular has been much more sketchy over time and been handed off to college administrators to a greater degree. But certainly the core vestige of this notion of faculty governance is still the faculty do the hiring of other faculty.
Exactly.
And so even if you took tenure out of the mix, as long as the faculty are making the decisions about, well, who do we give the PhDs to, who do we hire, who do we promote, who gets to teach in the classroom, that's also can lead to this same sort of effort to sort of, well, let's weed out the people we'd find disagreeable in various kinds of ways and keep the people that will say the same things we want to say.
So my girlfriend is a vice president at Willamette University. Yeah. She's been an administrator for her entire career, which meant we're natural enemies. So there's a civil war going on. No, actually, I learn a lot from her. And so she has very good relations with faculty and is good friends with many and always has been, but she's often quite annoyed with faculty, of course. Because
so am I. Anyone who knows faculty are often quite annoyed at faculty.
Thank you. Yes. I mean, that's the least of what I would say about them. But she blew me away with this. I thought I had the whole critique down, right? And then she said to me one day, you know, they keep talking about diversity. And of course, they only mean diversity of color.
Sure.
But whether it's diversity of color or intellectual diversity or any other kind of diversity, she said, you know what, the most important thing you could do to ensure diversity on campus is to eliminate tenure. If we eliminated tenure tomorrow, we can hire anybody we want. But right now, we have all these jobs that are lifetime appointments. Those people aren't going anywhere. And the vast majority of them, guess what, are not just white and male and straight and cis, but they also think alike.
Yeah.
And so, and they're not going anywhere. So if you're Black or trans or a woman or a anarcho-communist or an anarcho-capitalist or a libertarian or a neoconservative or whatever it is, you're not getting a job because of that primarily, right? They are unable to, they cannot hire enough people because of tenure to make it a truly diverse place because of all those jobs that are in concrete.
Yeah, no, certainly tenure.
So imagine, So then we started playing out this fantasy. Imagine, so what we have now is all these faculty on these campuses, right? Yelling constantly, oh my God, it's so homogeneous here. Everybody's white and everybody's a male. And
how do we fix that? Yeah.
And it's well, guess what? You know what you need to do? Give up your lifetime appointment so you can allow other people to come in.
No, certainly part of what makes the progress of better demographic diversity on campuses and in faculty ranks slow and difficult is precisely that generational turnover is very slow and difficult. And that doesn't fully solve the problem, but it's true that sort of at the younger ranks of faculty, you have more women than once was the case. You have more racial minorities than once was the case. But it takes a long time before the faculty as a whole is turning over because, as you say, you're not starting from a clean slate. You're not getting rid of all the old white guys and replacing them in one fell swoop. The challenge, of course, is okay, let's say you get rid of tenure, then the question becomes, and so maybe all those jobs become up for grabs right away or relatively soon. Say you shift to sort of long-term contracts instead, right, or something else, right? So maybe more jobs become available such that you could make more hiring decisions, and that would allow you to move more quickly to a new state of affairs, whatever you think the new state of affairs ought to be. And then the question is, well, who makes those decisions about who to hire? And one response is, well, the current faculty ought to make those decisions about who you ought to hire, in which case you still have a lot of the same issues. It's just now you got more jobs to play with rather than fewer jobs to play with. Or you say, well, no, never mind. Faculty make bad decisions about who they ought to hire. We ought to have administrators make decisions about who we ought to hire in the future. And I'm not very confident about what their decisions are going to look like, either from any of these perspectives, right, including the intellectual diversity perspective. It doesn't seem to me that college administrators' highest priority in making hiring decisions would be to foster greater intellectual diversity either.
Yeah, so get rid of the institution. No, really. I mean, so
yeah.
So I'm interested in, I guess, what would be called like artisan intellectuals, I suppose,
right,
maybe.
Right.
Right. Get rid of the administrator. We don't need that. Socrates didn't need administrators. He was the first academic in some ways, right? He did a pretty good job of teaching a lot of students.
Right.
And a lot of people have been doing it ever since. They're called public intellectuals. Some of them have been academics, but many, I'd say the most important public intellectuals actually probably have not been academics at least in this country. Does that seem right? I think that's right.
Certainly. It's
people who actually
right. I mean, there's certainly a lot of important public intellectuals who are not academics, and certainly it's a tiny fraction of academics who gain any kind of attention on the public stage and make any important contributions to those kinds of public discourses. I think in part there is value to things other than that kind of public intellectual work. I mean, I think that is an important aspect of what we want in the intellectual environment of the country. Yeah. But it's not everything that we want. Sure. And so universities do other things that are also important. But no, I think as a civil society, we would want an intellectual ecosystem that includes public intellectuals who are not attached to universities, that are making interesting contributions in the public sphere, as well as some that are in universities as well. I just think universities also have a contribution to make, and that they have, despite their various deficiencies, made important contributions over time and become sort of important institutions for not only educating students, but also producing knowledge and contributing to the store of ideas that matter in American society. So we ought to be very cautious about, so as a consequence, I am a little cautious about what kind of revolutionary reforms we want to adopt, and for fear that we will make the problem worse rather than make the problem better.
Yeah.
So that's my little nod to conservatism.
Okay.
As I am sometimes leery about big revolutionary changes, because I do worry that we're grasping for potential benefits and often wind up underestimating the potential downsides.
So here's the problem, Professor Whittington. Yeah. The revolution's happening, whether we like it or not.
That's true too.
I think. I mean, I don't know, but it sure looks like it.
Yeah.
It sure looks like it's happening to me, and I'm one very small part of it. But I think the whole podcasting world is basically now a new university.
Yeah.
I think it's a decentralized university of artisan intellectuals. Some of them are atrociously bad. Some of them are fantastically great.
Much like academia.
And some of them are sort of in the middle, right?
Right.
But it's this whole new place where all millions and millions of people are getting educated. And they're getting educated in ways that I think are largely better in some ways.
Right.
Because they're more tailored to what they want.
Sure.
And there's more actual, I think, depth, because people choose podcasts. These are people who are self-selecting students, essentially. They choose the podcast, they listen to the podcast, they study the podcast. If you know this world, You have people with ordinary jobs who are working at Walmart who are listening to podcasts while they work. I get this from my fans all the time. And I know this is true for other podcasters. It's one of my favorite things, by the way, when people say that they're cheating on their work by listening to this show. And then I also get, and I know other podcasters get this all the time too, the other greatest compliment you can get, and it's pretty common, is, oh, I listened to this episode twice or 3 times. Yeah. And I do that when I listen to podcasts. Right. I'm always often rewinding, right? Because it's so dense and rich in good ways. It's really intensive learning, and that I don't think I ever got myself in a college classroom. And all my years as a student, as an undergraduate and a graduate, I don't think I've ever had as a deeply immersive intellectual experience as I have had with a lot of podcasts I've listened to, you know? So.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think the rise of, podcasting, but also
YouTube,
features of internet more generally, YouTube, blogs, various other things, I think have been extraordinarily useful in bringing new opportunities and new voices to the fore and allowing people to explore that. So, for example, it's commonplace that when you talk to alums from an institution, they come back and they say, oh, well, I really wish I could now have the kind of experience that I was not paying much attention to when I was actually a student in college, because now I would appreciate it more now that I've sort of been out in the world for a while. And now I miss the fact that I'm not encountering ideas in the same way and readings in the same way. And I think these kinds of formats are precisely how you bring that lively intellectual experience to a wider range of people in a wider set of walks of life that can complement what universities do, sometimes replace what universities do to some degree as well. And I think that's part of what makes the world an exciting place at the moment, actually. Is although, if you look back 100, 200 years ago, people would have said something similar about printing presses, right? They had a lot of small printers that were publishing very small circulation pamphlets and handbills and newsletters and other kinds of things. And it had a similar effect, right? It opened the doors to lots of people to be able to communicate with smaller communities, often geographically specific communities, but allowed lots of ideas to flourish. And a lot of those ideas were crackpot and crazy and bad. And a lot of those ideas were fascinating and interesting and ultimately very influential. And so, we thrive as a society to the extent that we have those kinds of opportunities and openings. So I have no interest in trying to shut down all the other stuff. I just hope that the universities themselves don't become paralyzed and ultimately give up what they're good at.
Let me ask you this. I have been out of that game for a couple of years now, completely out of the game for 1 year, and then mostly out of the game for about the last 3 years. So I haven't talked to people about this, and I've been, during this time, I've been sort of immersed in this alternative world of podcasting, the internet, alternative higher education stuff. I've been wondering what the faculty are saying on campuses about this. Are they even aware of it? It seems to me they're mostly unaware.
I don't think they're mostly unaware, although it's hard, of course, generalizations like that are always problematic, right? And certainly a lot of people I talk to and I know are quite aware of it, and a fair number try to participate in it in various ways. And so, and so part of my time, so I'm based in the political science department, but I spend a lot of time talking to law professors and law schools, given the kind of work I do and that I'm interested in. And law professors in particular, I think, have been pretty aggressive about trying to extend into these other kinds of vehicles, in part because law professors traditionally have tried to bridge the gap between the ivory tower and the real world and try to communicate to broader audiences. They want to engage in a larger space in which a larger set of policymakers and the general public are participating in. And so I think there are parts of academia that have fully embraced this and seen it as a natural extension of what they do, although we only have so many hours in the day, so to some degree it's always competing a little bit with other things you're trying to do as well. And others probably are a little bit unaware of it. I'm sure that's true as well. I don't know how many people would see it necessarily as a threat to what they do per se. I think most faculty see it as slightly different than what they are trying to do themselves, and so they're offering a slightly different product in that sense.
The competition is having an effect?
No, so not necessarily a different product as a consequence of this effect, but I think that most people would say that the product that they're offering in universities is somewhat different than what people can get from podcasts and blogs and YouTube and the like. And so,
wait, which is what? I don't see that. What can they give that we can't give?
So I think so some of them, what we can give that others can't give may not be very attractive. Right. So part of it is and tenure.
Really good football teams.
Yeah. Well, there's that too. Right.
Yeah.
So which I think that's true. Actually, one feature of universities that I think will make them a little sticky, even in this new informational environment and credentialing environment and the like, is the fact that there are social networks that are formed on university campuses, and those are valuable both professionally and
social capital.
Social capital.
They definitely
so residential universities have a certain benefit for students attending them just because of that, laying aside anything that actually happens in the classroom or anything else.
Although, didn't Malcolm Gladwell pretty much show that that's a myth, that the social network effect is almost insignificant? That I think didn't he show that sort of like a Penn State graduate has really pretty much the same social capital as a Yale graduate, or in other words, they don't really, the ladder isn't much higher at Yale. I think that's right.
No, I think there's some truth in that, right? I mean, and so I think that that we sometimes overestimate the particular values of, to speak against interest, going to Princeton University as opposed to going to a state university. And I'm a product of a state university, so I think they're extraordinarily valuable and useful as well. And part of why they're useful is the connections students make in those universities as well. Certainly for some people, the entertainment value of football teams and the like is a no small part of the university experience and what universities offer to society. From my perspective, they're not one of the better features of academia.
What do you mean? You don't like football? You're from Texas.
I actually like football a lot, and I've come to
I love football.
Like college football.
I love basketball even more.
I've never gotten into basketball very much.
And I love, college basketball is my favorite sport of all time.
Yeah.
But I don't need it to be, but the thing is, I don't want it to be in the school I'm teaching in. Right?
Yes. No, so it's a weird feature of universities that we happen to have these semi-professional sports teams attached to them, and they can have a corrupting influence, which we've seen all too often, and especially I think maybe even more so in the modern era of where there's so much money at stake.
Yeah, because you and I are here to talk about ideas.
Yeah.
So football is not about talking about ideas.
No, that's not, and that's exactly right. And so, and in some ways, football does bring some students in the door. For example, they come because of the football, they know universities because of that, and that's what they want to experience in universities. And then you're sort of hoping to squeeze some ideas into them while they're there in between fraternity parties and football games.
Let me introduce a paradox within the paradox here. So, actually, having just said that, I've said this many times over the years. I think I might have even said this on this podcast. I've had, a lot of football players and basketball players in my classes, right?
Right.
And they've been fantastic.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons is that they're, at least where I've taught, in sort of places like Columbia and Occidental, they're basically marginal figures. Right. They're not really of this culture, generally speaking. Right. They tend to be more working class. They tend to be less of that world. And they also tend to be not of this world politically. Right. They tend to be, at least in my experience, more what would be called conservative or maybe right-leaning. And so they actually, ironically, were the ones who provided some intellectual diversity in my classrooms.
No, for sure. One of the potential benefits of student athletes is that they often have a different set of background experiences than other students. And so they may be more likely to come from working class backgrounds and maybe more likely to be first generation college students. Mm-hmm. They do often have different political and cultural and social commitments and interests than other students, and as well as racial demographics and other things. And so there are some demographic consequences for what the makeup of the student population is as a consequence of having lots of sports on campus. And I also find them not, so they also, I've experienced the same thing you have of that they often have interesting ideas and they're coming at things from a slightly different angle than other students do. And that's often very attractive and interesting. I also find, although admittedly Princeton University athletes maybe a different kettle of fish than some other places, but I also find that student athletes are very interesting in the sense that they are very focused, right? I mean, they are managing their time very carefully.
They're disciplined.
They're very disciplined.
Yes.
And partially that's why some successful athletes is they're very disciplined, but also they have to be disciplined because they are very time constrained. And so I'm impressed by, sometimes they can't keep up with it as a consequence of the other commitments, but I'm always impressed by students, in particular things like basketball and baseball, where students are traveling often for a lot of times, and they're trying to write papers on the road from a team bus, right?
Yes.
And it's remarkable, right, how well they do that.
And I say this to the other students. I say, you know what? That's more what life looks like,
right?
Actually, outside this place,
right?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've really loved in this sort of change in career I've had recently is that I've been around people who are not of that world, not of the world of academia, of the academic left, and all that stuff. So a lot of people who come to Renegade University are, a lot of them have gone to college, a lot of them have graduated from college, but generally speaking, they sort of have normal jobs. They're not of this rarefied world that we inhabit. And I love it. And then also I've been living in Salem, Oregon, which is a very working class town.
Right.
And so, I've made more friends in 2 years in Salem than I did in 6 years in Los Angeles.
Right.
And overwhelmingly, the people I know there are what I would call working class Oregonians, white working class, some Mexican, a couple black, but mostly white working class. And it's just, it's like we're from different planets.
Yeah.
But I love it, and I love them and I love hanging out with them because they're so not of this world. First of all, there's no sort of competition between us because there's nothing to compete over.
Sure.
But what's been striking to me is just how separate these worlds are.
Yeah.
And this is a lot about sort of, I think the recent election was about this very much. To me, it represented sort of what I call a civil war that's going on between those who are what I call of college and those who are not of college, meaning those who are acculturated into this world, this culture in colleges and universities, and those who are not of that world. And it's really stark, the difference. I think just people's bearing, their manner, their way of speaking, the places they shop, it's much of it is determined by that. So I can sort of tell, like when I meet someone, two things about them pretty quickly: whether they've gone to college, like an elite college, not a community college, and whether they've gone to therapy.
Right.
Really. So, but, and I'm slightly embarrassed. No, I'm very embarrassed that, I always fancied myself a fairly savvy, I was always very aware of popular culture when I was an academic, like at Columbia, right? I always thought of myself as, I'm kind of an academic of the street a little bit. No, you weren't. No, you weren't, dickhead. You didn't know shit about these people, and they didn't know shit about you, but they don't care. And the thing is, they weren't making claims about us, but we make claims about them and their consciousness and their desires and their needs every day for a living. Yeah. Anyway.
No, for sure. I think it's a very segmented universe, and it's easy to lose sight of sort of what's outside your particular silo, right? If you spend all your time talking to other academics in a university town, it's easy to lose sight of what the rest of the world, the rest of America looks like, and what they value and care about and interested in, and what kind of ideas they have, and beliefs and commitments they have. And part for me, my extended family has been interestingly helpful in that sense of sort of keeping me grounded. Of sort of I had plenty of relatives.
You're from both worlds. That's right.
I am a little bit from both worlds.
Very
I
much.
I wouldn't want to exaggerate that, but I certainly had more than one relative whose view of things was, so you're doing fairly well at Princeton. So when does that mean you can leave there and get a good job, which means a job in Texas, right?
Exactly.
So when can you come back to where you
to
are?
the oil fields?
To the oil fields. Well, not necessarily the oil fields, but even the university in Texas itself, right? I mean, so there's just not that sense of.
So they don't even know or care about Princeton being important.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
From their perspective, it's
isn't that great? I love that.
Yeah, no, but so
they don't care.
There's nothing particularly special about Princeton University from their perspective. It's way outside their world. Has no particular relevance to that, and it was. I continue to find it useful to be reminded of the fact that there are lots of people in the world who think that way, whereas those in this little bubble around Princeton don't think that way. But it's also the attitude that I arrived at Princeton with, right? And so I found it a little weird that all my colleagues were sort of, oh, well, how many generations of Harvard have you been, right? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's like, none, right?
Mm-hmm. So you're first generation college?
My father was. My parents were first generation college. They went to a little teachers college in Texas. And then I went to state school there in Texas.
And you went to public schools as a kid?
I went to public schools as a kid. No, it's nothing else was even on the radar screen.
Yeah, and this was outside of Houston?
Outside of Houston. So I grew up in a little rice farming town, which is now sort of subdivisions and suburbs of it, but at the time,
you're of that.
At the time, it was rice fields and tractors.
You're of that world, yeah. You're part of working class America, or what is now called Trump America.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and of course, I've been away from that for quite some time now, so I feel kind of distant from it. But it's but certainly when I came to the Northeast for the first time, I went to grad school at Yale. Eventually, got a job at Princeton. Those places seem extraordinarily distant from where I grew up, and the culture shock was pretty severe of making that move. And so I value those institutions. I've enjoyed them. I've gotten lots out of them. They're tremendous in all kinds of ways, but they don't feel like home in the same way. And and I miss home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do genuinely value what they have to offer and what they've given me, in particular, the kind of life that they've allowed, of a place where I can talk to interesting people and think about ideas that I find important and try to write about things that I find valuable. And so in that sense, I feel extraordinarily lucky that I've had an institutional, the institutional base to be able to do that kind of thing. And one of the things that drove me to write this book is a concern that that those institutions, as I think of them at least, are under genuine threat and may not survive into future generations in the same kind of way. Right? Mm-hmm. They, not only might they be just displaced entirely and go out of business from other kinds of competing institutions. And some I think will, probably not Princeton, but other institutions on the margins I think will, given the other kinds of educational opportunities and certification opportunities that are available in the current marketplace. But also just as institutions that see themselves as, at least in part, about trying to learn things rather than trying to advance a political agenda, for example, and I think, or merely trying to train a set of workers. And I think both those things, whether if we think about universities as they're primarily all about trying to advance a political cause, which can be deadly to free intellectual inquiry on a college campus. But also if we think of universities as primarily just trying to certify a bunch of workers to push into corporations, that also can be deadly to intellectual inquiry. And I think both those pressures on universities are very much there right now. And I'm not sure if one or the other is going to win out, but they both squeeze against what I think of as being the best of the university, which is a commitment to taking ideas seriously and trying to explore them.
Yeah, I don't think I think at the elite level, sort of, the USA Today top 200 or whatever, right? Those schools, the research universities and the top national liberal arts colleges, right? They're not training workers, they're training leaders still, aren't they? Yeah. They want their people, they want their students to end up in government and in places of influence. They want them to be writing for the New York Times. They want them to be running for mayor of Los Angeles. They want them to be running for president of the United States. They want all that, don't they?
I think that's right. I think it's probably actually a smaller slice of the university world that sees itself quite that way than
well, what do you want your students to be?
Well, I think so. Princeton sees itself that way, but I'm not sure I'd say it's as many as 200 institutions, for example. So, so in part, I think about my own alma mater of University of Texas at Austin, right? When I was growing up in Texas, in the midst of the oil boom, the slogan that politicians adopted in the state was, we want to build a world-class university. And so we're going to use all this oil money and we're going to try to hire away Nobel Prize winners in the sciences to come to the University of Texas and build a great research university that can rival the Harvards and Princetons of the world. Right? The political rhetoric surrounding University of Texas in particular and state schools in Texas, but also state schools in lots of other places, is very different than that today, right? Instead, there's much more of an emphasis on how cheaply can you teach lots of students, give them degrees so they can go out and be productive members of society. And so there's a lot less attention, I think, and focus on will they become the mayor of Los Angeles or will they become a New York Times columnist, and much more of will they be effective coders and have a middle class job.
Oh yeah.
And that's an important consideration. Certainly, my dad, when he was sending me to college, his concern was, there's got to be a job on the other end of that, right? So he was very concerned with the practicalities.
That's also, there's this split between STEM. Yes. Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right. On the one hand, which tends to be more vocational, and always has been. And that's always made sense to me. The whole STEM, I think STEM in colleges and universities is just fine, and I'm all for it. You guys keep doing your thing and cure cancer as fast as you can.
Right.
God bless you.
Right.
The other half of universities where we are, which is the humanities and social sciences, which is a cesspool, a snake pit, a hellhole, a hellscape. But no, my point is that I think that half has, at least certainly at the elite level, but I think even at the state college level, the faculty certainly have wanted their students, by and large, and I'm one of them, to go out and be leaders, either intellectual leaders, what's called thought leaders, one of the worst terms, but political leaders, the great people of our world, right? Isn't that true?
No, I think that's probably
for our colleagues.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right for the faculty, but I think in part about the kind of pressures coming now from politicians, from university administrators and the like, and part of that pressure is to say, well, let's shrink the social sciences and humanities precisely because they're filled with people who want to produce New York Times columnists, and instead let's expand other parts of the university that are going to produce students who are appropriately trained for the modern economy and can get the right kinds of jobs and the like.
Right.
And
so what you're talking about, which I know is happening, is what lefties call the the rise of the neoliberal university, or neoliberalism on universities, which is one of the most absurd, not the way you're putting it, but the way they put it is one of the most absurd things I've ever heard.
I think they have valuable insights. I mean, I think they have put their finger on some important pressures in universities. I don't follow them all the way in where they want to go with that.
I mean, their description of what's going on matches my description of what's going on, but the analysis is completely ridiculous to me. So the reason, for instance, we have so many adjunct faculty, contingent faculty like me, which is now I think pretty much a majority, or at least close to a majority of all faculty in this country are adjuncts, contingent faculty, is that our generation in particular, because we're of the same generation, we all decided to go to grad school when we were told there weren't enough jobs for all of us. We were told. Yeah. I don't know if you were, but I certainly was. It was not kept a secret that there were not enough jobs for all of us. Not even close.
Yeah.
And so we were deliberately, and it's in part because most of the people in our field are rich kids. Not you and me.
I wasn't told much of anything, actually. So
oh, really?
So I sort of stumbled into graduate school.
Wow. You didn't know that the job market was as bad as it was?
So I knew it was very hard to get a job, but I actually had no realistic idea of what that meant in practice.
So just so people know, because a lot of people who listen to this are not of college, you know, in this way. And even a lot of people who are of college don't know how this works. In our fields, I know in my field, I think it's the same for yours. Whenever I applied for a job, at least 500 people applied for it as well. I was competing against at least 500 people for every job. So think about those odds, right? That's what we were choosing to enter as a profession. We are idiots. We are the responsibility for, quote, neoliberalism and the rise of the adjunct proletariat is us. We're the ones, right? We chose to do that. We entered that market. And so we flooded that market and made ourselves very, very cheap and disposable as labor.
Yeah, I do think that's an important...
Ridiculous to claim anything else. It's as if it was not a conspiracy of administrators. I'm not defending administrators. I don't care, even though I'm basically married to one. I don't know, but that's sort of obvious, right? If you flood the labor market, that's what's going to happen. And we chose, no one told me to go to grad school or even in any way suggested that I go to grad school. It certainly didn't compel me to, right?
No, I think that's right. I mean, part of the rise of tenure in the first place was an effort to attract PhDs to teach in academia when there were not enough PhDs to do that. And they had lots of opportunities outside of academia. And so tenure rose precisely because it was a difficult job market for hiring. And so, and PhDs had a lot of sway in that context. And instead you have a glut of PhDs. It's not surprising it's going to undermine tenure protections as well, because it's easy to say, well, there are people willing to teach at on these short-term contracts and lower pay and the like. And I think, I think universities and faculty more particularly at research universities that are producing PhDs have a really serious responsibility to, one, advise students correctly about what those job prospects look like and not send people out there to grad school without a fairly clear-eyed view of what it is they're getting into. But also, I think we have a real genuine responsibility to think about our grad students in these institutions, and can you actually place them in jobs, and are you producing too many? Certainly there are lots of institutions that are producing more grad students than they ought to.
The number of PhDs each school should be producing is about 1. No, really, right? I mean, for the available tenure track jobs out there, I mean, it's about, those are the numbers essentially. Like of all the graduate programs, you compare that, I don't know, but compare that with the number of available jobs, it's about 1 to 1.
No, in some fields that's certainly true, right? I mean, some fields are shrinking in that way. I mean, I think it's also true that so political science is not in the same sort of dire straits from a market perspective as history is. No, we're better than y'all are, but it's still not great. I mean, there's certainly.
How many applicants do you get for like what you're in, American political development or political theory?
Well, so for example, we have the searches in comparative politics, which is a fairly big field with lots of students in it. It wouldn't be uncommon that we'll get 300 applicants per job in that field, right? And so, and of course, you can shrink that by being much more specific about what you're looking for, right? So if you're looking for somebody specifically to do, Eastern European politics, that will shrink the pool quite a lot as to how many people are qualified to apply for that job.
Yeah.
But no, the fact of the matter is, even in political science, there's lots of people running around relative to all jobs. I think political science is a little better about sort of at the end of the day, most PhDs are able to find jobs, but it's certainly not all. But the humanities in general, and for this purpose, I think history sort of looks more like the humanities, more generally like English departments and the like. Fact is, they're generating way more PhDs than they could ever place in tenure track jobs. And I think the interesting thing is if you look at, say, the STEM fields, for example, a lot of their PhDs don't go into academia, right? They're going into private sector jobs and industry and the like. And so they don't necessarily even think of themselves as.
You know why? Because they're sensible people.
They're sensible people. They have the job skills that are valued in other places and all that kind of thing. No, exactly. But as a consequence, their orientation toward training grad school students is a little different as well, right? And so I think those of us in the humanities and social sciences are often a little insulated. We think about, well, we're training people to be professors and nothing else really. Yes, whereas if you talk to somebody in electrical engineering, they don't necessarily think of that's what they're doing, is training PhD students.
That's right.
It's like some of them might be professors, but a lot of them are going to be something else, right? And so,
and your dad was a sort of a practical STEM
person? No, so my dad was a chemist, and for him that was sort of they're actually jobs and that kind of thing. And
lots of them, he understood, especially in Texas.
No, exactly. So he totally understood that so his father's advice. So my dad was first person in his family to go to college, and his father said, well, maybe you should be a mortician because people are always dying, and there's a steady market for morticians. And my dad thought, a mortician doesn't seem that great of a job. But chemists, those actually do things, and there are jobs in that. And he was right. There were jobs in that. And so when I went to college, he sort of had very much that same attitude of if you're going to college, you ought to be able to get a job on the other end of it. And so originally I was going to major in electrical and chemical engineering. Pretty quickly decided that's not what I wanted to do. And he was pretty upfront that if you expect me to contribute to your college degree financially, you should do something that could actually lead to a job. And so I was a triple major at Texas. I did finance and honors business, and then I did sort of government on the side.
So that you could get help from your dad?
Well, and kept my opportunities open for jobs. But it's also true. I found those things interesting. So a lot of people in the social sciences and humanities want to poo-poo business schools, and I found them intellectually fascinating.
It's the opposite. I would love to actually. I've thought I would love to go back and get an MBA.
No, I think they're interesting degrees. I mean, I thought so. So I thought my own experience in finance was I thought that it was a little repetitive over time. But accounting, for example, I thought was totally fascinating.
Really?
I did actually. So I took far more accounting classes than I needed to for my degree because I found them so interesting.
Tell me in the world how accounting is fascinating.
So if you really want to understand the guts of businesses and how they operate, accounting is the field that's really focused on that. And so finance is very narrowly focused on thinking about, rates of return and risks. And so it's as a consequence, it's fairly abstract
and strategic rather than tactical.
It's very strategic. Okay. It's very abstract. It's a lot about sort of equations in that sense.
It's the stuff that we like.
Yeah. Okay. And things like marketing, are kind of touchy-feely in what they do. Yep. Management is similar kind of thing. But accounting is very hard-nosed, right? And very focused on the bottom line of sort of, okay, how much do things cost?
That's right.
Where's the revenue coming from? And how does the revenue cover the cost? Right? And how do you penetrate into a complex organization and get a handle on that, right? And so part of what I found so fascinating about accounting was were the ways of trying to figure out how do you penetrate into a complex organization and expose its guts and how it works and keep track of it in some kind of coherent way. And of course, profit-making organizations are much easier than nonprofit organizations in that sense because there is a bottom line. At the end of the day, things are supposed to be producing money.
That's right.
And so it does allow you to have a through point that you can track. And part of what's complicated about nonprofit bureaucracies and the like is they don't have that same kind of bottom line mentality. And so some of the tools that are available in a for-profit enterprise that helps you guide that institution, discipline that institution, keep it on track, make decisions about how to prioritize things inside of it, just aren't available in the same way in a government bureaucracy or in a university setting, for example, because people don't agree on what the bottom line is.
It's funny. All my experiences with accountants firsthand have resulted in me feeling terribly ashamed.
Shamed in what sense?
Oh, well, because they know exactly how much money I have, exactly how much money I'm making, exactly how much money I'm spending. And they'll tell me, Thad, it's not adding up.
Yeah. Right.
And it's not because they're mean. It's not because they want to shame me. That's what their job is. This is what you're saying. This is accounting. Their personalities are different. That's what they care about. And they are truly sensible and conscientious and conservative in a good way, right? It's like the ship will sink if you continue to do this.
No, that's right.
And they are correct within this world, right? Within this world and within its rules and within this culture. That's true.
Yeah, no, that's part of what I liked about accounting in that sense. I mean, it is very hard-nosed in that sense. It's very focused on what's necessary to make things work. And it's also very careful, right? I mean, so it's not just unlike the humanities, which I think often is not very careful, right? And so
no kidding.
Often it can be very loose, right? Yeah. Whereas accounting, the details matter, and so it's very detail focused, and they force your attention on. You can't just BS your way through it. You got to actually be careful and correct and very specific. And as a consequence, I thought accounting was a very challenging field and take classes in. Right?
Yeah.
There's the exams at the end of that semester were among the hardest I took while I was an undergraduate, and precisely in part because they have clear right and wrong answers. They're very detail focused, but the concepts can often be challenging.
So how did you, so you clearly are an intellectual. I mean, just sort of as a personality. Where'd that come from?
I don't know where that came from, really. I mean, it's, I was always very bookish in that sense and found ideas fascinating. My mom was an elementary school teacher and she valued ideas and sort of pushed me to think about them. I think my dad probably was less talkative about it, but also introduced me to lots of ideas. So some of these sort of early works in history of political philosophy and other things that I was starting to encounter in junior high and high school were initially things that my mom and dad were handing me and saying, hey, you might find this interesting. And I was bookish enough that I did find those things interesting. Right?
This is weird, but I just can't help but thinking, because I just interviewed someone recently, Kevin Williamson. He's also from a small town in Texas, and he's also an intellectual.
Right.
And in these cases, I can't help but thinking, Texas, I think Texas, really hot, really flat, really dry, really barren, often sort of desolate. I can imagine how a dark, quiet, cool room with a book would be very, very attractive.
It does have its attractions if you have air conditioning. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
A library, right? A library, a nicely, the UT Austin or any decent, even public library in Texas would be sort of an oasis for me. I can completely understand that.
Although I gotta think some of these things are just deeply ingrained personality traits that
I'm sure.
I found myself attracted to books and ideas. I was more than happy to stay up all night reading books in ways that my friends thought was idiotic. And so, so my dream as a little kid was it'd be great if I could get a job in which people would sponsor me to read books. So I sort of imagined myself as like a adult race car driver with a uniform covered with advertising banners, but they'd all be dedicated to providing me the opportunity to read books. So if only I could find a way of doing that. And it turns out academia is the way of doing it, right? Somebody will pay you to actually read stuff, right? So.
Hence your defense of the higher education system.
No, exactly. It's all it's all about me.
Well, of course.
No, exactly.
So it is for me.
Right. How do we create an institution that can employ pointy-headed people like me to spend their time reading books?
So here's my contradiction, my own contradiction. So guess what? You may have noticed I'm somewhat cynical about our profession.
Sure.
No, I'm totally cynical and kind of want to burn it all down, actually. I don't want to burn you down, but I don't want to burn everybody down who's within it. I want to burn a few people.
But a lot of things ought to be burned down.
But I would like to just let it go and have it subject to market forces and let it go. And I think we'd all be way better off. However, let me say this. I loved college.
Right.
Loved college. That's why I became a professor.
Right.
That's why I became an academic, because I saw that as a life,
as
a thing I could do, or at least I thought I could do, and I had modest ambitions. I just wanted a decent little house and teach my classes and be on those nice little college campuses and teach, friendly, energetic, exuberant 19-year-olds. Yeah. So it's interesting. So I think it's not always so bad for the kids who go to those schools.
Right.
I just think that most kids, for one thing, are not like me and not like you, even at Princeton.
No, totally.
But certainly at most colleges, they're not intellectuals at all.
No,
They're not going to care ever, no matter how good we are as teachers about this stuff. I mean, some kids you can turn, but a lot of kids just are never going to.
Yeah.
And it's sort of the height of imperialist arrogance to assume that they will and should think about things that we think about and care about those things.
No, for sure. Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it was often a frustration of mine sort of early in my career in particular, because it's easy to imagine that all your students are like you. And they're just not. Right?
Potentially.
Or potentially like you.
There's potential Keiths and Thads.
Right, but they were like me when I was their age and when I was a student, right? And the vast majority of them are not, right? And they're not interested in the same things. They aren't intrinsically fascinated by the ideas. And it took me a while to sort of get my head around that fact and appreciate it, but also to appreciate then what they are getting out of it, what they can get out of it. Even if they're not getting out of it the same things that I would have or that I would want them to fully get out of it. And so one of the interesting challenges of teaching is, how do you meet the students where they are, right? And so you do need them to participate. It helps that they will meet you at least halfway. And one of the great things about being at Princeton is students are more than willing to meet you halfway. They actually will do the readings. They will come and talk about the stuff. And it may not be their highest priority either. They may not be intrinsically fascinated by the ideas. They may have other things in their lives and their aspirations that they find more appealing than that. But they're willing to meet you on that plane, and you can talk things through. But it can be a challenge as to how do you make the college experience useful and interesting to the average student who is not internally intrinsically motivated by a fascination with ideas per se, but instead they came to college because people told them they ought to, because that's how you get a good job, because they really like parties and football, or whatever.
Yeah. So I read your book at least as classical liberalism. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's safe. So I'm of course too big to fit in any box, and so I resist labels. But that's probably as good as label as any.
Yeah, I mean, you've written many books. You've done a lot of other work. You've done work on antebellum, political intellectuals. But I think this particular book and the argument in it, which is a fairly discrete argument, I think it's pretty well inside the classical liberal.
No, I think it's
bounds.
I think that's totally right. It
Okay.
totally is comes out of a intellectual tradition that I try to explicitly ground in John Stuart Mill and his thinking and the kinds of arguments that I want to make in the book. I think are sometimes straight out of Mill and sometimes modifications or extensions of sort of Millian ideas, but it's very much in that liberal tradition.
So do a quick little mini seminar on John Stuart Mill.
Sure. So John Stuart Mill was an English intellectual, maybe the best way of phrasing it. So he pursued lots of different intellectual interests across his lifetime. In the first half of the 19th century, he wrote extraordinarily important works in philosophy and economics and political philosophy. And he was, in particular, for me, particularly important in the little book on liberty that he wrote, which is short, still is very readable, but was a defense of trying to create a civil society in which people had a great deal of freedom to be individuals. And he was worried about the pressures that were not primarily governmental pressures, but pressures in society itself to conform, to follow the crowd, to follow the orthodoxy. And he thought it was critically important to the progress of the human race, ultimately, that we preserve space so that individuals can be unconventional and follow their own ideas and their own ways of living. And sometimes they're going to make mistakes and fall on their face in doing that. And sometimes they're going to have great insights that will ultimately be to the benefit of humanity more broadly. So on liberty in particular, I found really influential inform my own thinking as a teenager and starting to think about these kinds of ideas. And those ideas then are pretty central to thinking about these issues of free speech in the university context, but also I think more broadly in civil society. But he's also pretty interesting as a philosopher of utilitarianism, and his work on political economy, of course, has now been supplanted by more recent stuff. But actually, I found it intellectually quite interesting as well, even his stuff on that. He's an early advocate of women's rights and women's liberation, which I think is actually still holds up quite well. He wrote a fascinating autobiography.
Really?
Yeah, he did actually, which I found very depressing, actually, because he was one of these. His father was a philosopher, and probably it made me think probably the most dangerous thing to be is the son of a philosopher, because maybe particularly in the 19th century, because he really was sort of experimenting on his kid about how to train up the next generation of brilliant geniuses. And John Stuart Mill sort of cracked under the pressure a little bit at a young age as well. And, but he was extraordinarily accomplished, and so all the things he was doing as a small child is just extraordinarily impressive.
Wow, really? I didn't know that about him. So I don't know a lot about Mill. I've read on liberty, but he is one of the great classical liberals of the 19th century, right? But I have read fairly deeply in other classical liberal work, notably Locke. And recently I've been reading this guy, Emmer de Vattel, who's basically the founder of international law. Right. Basically a Lockean, sort of a Lockean argument applied to international relations. So here's the thing about, in my experience, reading it, not with Mill, because I haven't done enough reading on him, but with those guys, with the other classical liberals of the 19th and earlier, 18th century, and 17th century, is that there's always the big book. Right. Locke, there's the second treatise. Vattel is the law of nations, right? Right. Mill is on liberty, but usually what I find is in those famous books that are so influential that everyone talks about, it's about institutions, it's about sort of high politics, it's about abstract ideas about rights, all this. And then there's always, but then if you think, then again, like, what else did these guys write? Because they couldn't have just written, they have all these other books. And you'll often find, certainly in Locke's case, you'll find all these other books in which he starts to sort of veer off the path and start to talk about other things that are not, he's not sure entirely that they're relevant, but they are relevant, which is about things like culture. Yeah. And essentially, they wouldn't use this term, but psychology and personality, right? What the individual, who they claim should have freedom, here it is, should do with their own lives, right? So there's all this moralizing about what's good and bad for you to do in your daily life, right? And so, for instance, John Locke, I don't know if you know this, wrote pretty extensively about dancing and how bad it was, right?
I didn't know
And
that.
a lot of it's essentially an implicit, puritanical denunciation of sexuality. Yeah. The work ethic runs all the way through it. The Puritan Protestant work ethic runs all the way through his work, right? We should be working. We should be productive. Right. I mean, that's sort of, that's constitutive part of his argument about natural rights, right? Labor, mixing your labor with the soil gives you rights to property, et cetera, and sovereign rights, et cetera. So it's a nation of workers, basically, productive workers, that he's trying to create. So which gave rise later to analysts of classical liberalism, this idea of the self-regulating or self-disciplining individual, right? So a lot of people who study these guys talk about that as being the center, the core of classical liberalism. I don't know if that's true for Mill. I'll bet you a bagel that there's somewhere in Mill, I don't know, you can tell me, but does he ever talk about stuff like that? About personal morality?
Yeah, no, there's certainly elements of that. I mean, so Mill, I think, is a very different kind of figure than John Locke, for example, in the sense of Mill's a bit scandalous in his society at the time, and the sense of he embraces women's rights, and he doesn't necessarily want to follow the conventions of English society of the period. And part of his defense of individualism is a defense of those conventions of upper class English life, as well as sort of this concern about mass democracy as such. But certainly he has his own views about sort of how one ought to live your life, preferably, and you know, I think it's not uncommon for, you know, like he says, Locke's are the particular extensions of thinking about it's important for people to be productive. It's that they ought to be, you know, not dancing
and rational,
but rationality, and that's crucial for Mill as well. Thinking about rationality is very important. He thinks that sort of the way he characterizes sort of higher pleasures are much more important.
There you go. That's it.
Right, and part, but he thinks that, you know, the only people who have experienced both the higher and the lower pleasures can really appreciate the fact that the higher pleasures are better, and so. That's it. And so in part, he thinks that people ought to be exposed to that, because he would think that people will come to appreciate it if they're exposed to it. But it will lead them to valuing things that he finds particularly valuable.
He had the narcissism that you and I have had, right?
Of course.
Oh, everyone's like me.
Does, right?
Everyone's like me. They've just been, you know, they haven't had the opportunities I had to become me.
Right. If everybody spent their time reading books all night, they would love it.
They haven't had the opportunity to become me. That's their problem, but I'm going to make them me, and then they'll be happy and fulfill their destiny. It's a tremendous, and, you know, I've suffered from this, and I think you have too. You said this, you know, it's a tremendously, as I said before, it's an imperialist narcissism, I suppose, right?
It is, although I think part of what's interesting about the classical liberal tradition more generally, as it sort of carries through, and Mill's part of the ones who sort of introduces that, sort of Mill's emphasis on individualism, I think, is sort of a move that's importantly different than what you see in kind of Locke, for example, who's not emphasized. He emphasizes rights, but he doesn't emphasize individualism as such. Whereas Mill's very concerned about we're constructing a mass society in which the individual voice, the individual mind is going to be lost, and people need the freedom to express their own personality, and people ought to have the freedom to be unconventional and go a different direction than what the crowd is going to go in. And that's the beginning, I think, of a trajectory that gets embedded in lots of classical liberal thought across the rest of the 19th century and in the 20th century, that's emphasizing not only do people have rights, but part of why they have rights and part of what they ought to have rights to is to be different than everybody else. And whatever the particular thing is that they're different about, right? And so that may mean that they're different because they have different sexual mores that they want to pursue than everybody else. Or maybe they're different because they want to be a bookish intellectual rather than hanging out drinking in the pub, or whatever. But that part of what freedom is about is protecting space in which people can do those things. And part of what I find interesting, and part of what I find useful for this book, in particular with Mill, is Mill's not, he's an English philosopher. He's not concerned about American constitutional law, for example. So he's not trying to talk about what are your constitutional rights, how do we interpret a text, and what those rights are. And he's not even that concerned about, especially when you think about freedom of thought, for example, he's not that concerned about the government as such. What he's concerned about is the pressures of civil society, right? So how do we make space within our society for there to be dissenters and people who are disagreeable and disagree with us in various ways? And so he doesn't have universities particularly in mind. He's thinking more about libraries and debating societies and other kinds of things. Those are the more robust institutions that are attractive to him. I think universities sort of come later as being actually interesting from that kind of perspective. But part of what I think is valuable from in this sense is to think about, we should think not only in terms of sort of what are the rules we're forced to follow, but also what kind of society should we construct, and why is it okay for people to be different in that society? They can live different lives, they can have different ideas, and that we ought to tolerate that and appreciate the value of that. And Mill, I think, was critically important in sort of injecting that kind of sort of countercultural concern into classical liberalism that then I think does become sort of important in later ways of thinking about it.
Professor Whittington, I'm not convinced. I think so. This concept of toleration, which is a Millian concept, which you use a lot in your in this book, at least. Yeah. I had a Marxist tell me about 500 years ago that I don't like this idea of toleration, and I didn't know what he was talking about because I thought toleration was great and we should all strive for that. And it took me about 500 years to understand what he was talking about. It's that this idea, this liberal toleration, this Millian concept, is we'll let you exist, but we will not, here it is, we will not invite you to Princeton.
Right.
And I've seen you make a similar argument, which is, I think you said somewhere in an interview that, what's his face, the Australian philosopher, Singer, Peter Singer, who's very controversial in certain ways, but, he's sort of an academic, respected intellectual. You said, well, I mean, it would be stupid not to have him on college campuses talking to us. But Richard Spencer, on the other hand, he, you said I wouldn't ban him, but I also wouldn't invite him.
Right.
Because you didn't really flesh it out, but I'm assuming because you thought, well, actually, why? Why not?
So my concern on that, I think, is not necessarily where the argument leads for him, but just how robust and interesting the argument itself is. Okay. And so are there important ideas there that are worth mulling over and thinking carefully about? And so I think universities ought to be very open to not only sort of allowing people to be on campus that you think are disagreeable, but they ought to be actively trying to bring people to campus that have ideas that are going to rub them the wrong way. But I think the thing that ought to be guiding us as we're trying to figure out who should we bring to campus is not merely does it rub us the wrong way, but we ought to be thinking about, is this going to be interesting and helpful and productive, and will it lead to better insights, either into American society and what's influencing it and what kind of ideas are regnant in our current age, or do they bring important ideas to bear on trying to understand the human condition and how the world works and that kind of thing. And so my initial thought is that Richard Spencer wouldn't be that interesting of a figure to bring for in under that kind of rubric. But I'm open to persuasion that no, it turns out he's actually really interesting, and you could learn a lot from talking to him or having him come give a talk on campus. And if that was true, I'd be open to bringing him too, and we ought to be looking for opportunities to do it. So
I think he's fascinating, and I think quite a bit of what he says is essentially sort of 19th century scientific racism. And he knows this, of course. This is what, he, but that is, to me, essentially superstition. Although I don't think I think that about a lot of what's said in social sciences at Princeton and Columbia and everywhere, right? I mean, and in fact, I think he's in many ways probably a more principled intellectual than a lot of our colleagues are.
Right.
You know, I think scientific racism is just scientific bullshit,
right?
You know, and I don't even sort of care about it other than that. But the way he puts it, he does as good a job, I think, as you can of putting forward that argument in the 21st century. And it's great to really expose yourself to this stuff that is so taboo, that is never really confronted on these college campuses, right?
Yeah.
It's a tonic to me. I love listening to that stuff because it's like, wow, no one ever says this.
Yeah.
Let's hear it. And also he represents, and we certainly all agree on this, he represents a major strain in American and Western political intellectual thought.
So I don't know how big of a strain he represents. I mean, he certainly was something that was at one point quite influential.
Oh, historically.
Right? Yeah,
historically,
right? And so how big of a strain it is in current thought, and I'm less certain about.
Well, it's an underground strain.
No, that's right. And so, I think, like I said, I think that for my money, the thing that ought to be guiding us in thinking about who's interesting and useful to bring to campuses is not a question about, well, are they too extreme? Are these ideas too out there? But instead, are they carefully developed and carefully argued such that you can get something out of having the conversation? And if the answer to that's yes, then bring them, right? Let's hear them, and you might at the end of the day walk away thinking, well, that was crazy, but that's fine.
Yeah.
And you may still learn something in that process, right? And the things you might learn is not, well, it turns out he was more right than I thought. The things you might learn is, well, now I understand why I think what I think much better than I did before. It's precisely by engaging those ideas and figuring out why it is I think they're wrong that can deepen my own understanding of my own ideas, and that itself is valuable.
Yeah. So I think, I hope this isn't too provocative or antagonistic, but I think that Mill's concept of toleration is essentially an elitist policing mechanism, that it's a way to say, we'll let you exist. In fact, I think it's a more effective elitist policing mechanism, because rather than kill the peasants or throw them in the dungeon, we say, oh no, you're fine, we'll let you exist. So it sort of buys them off. But but the Princetons and the Columbias and the colleges and the government and the newspapers, that's where we are, and you don't get to be here. And it's funny that Richard Spencer would be, in a sense, the target of that, because he's a straight white man who speaks in these classically, elitist ways. It's funny enough, but these days that is actually considered to be beyond the pale, so to speak.
Yeah, so, no, he's a prominent example now. I mean, if 10 years ago it would have been somebody else, you'd point to it, maybe with a very different profile and set of commitments, right? And so
here's a quote from your book.
Sure.
You say, but we also need to make choices outside the classroom about what ideas are worth debating and how, including those ideas, is what you've been saying, including those ideas that we do not think are academically serious. We should want to hear from the best, most serious advocates of ideas that matter to our public debates. And right there, I'm completely on board with you.
Right.
Even if those ideas are outside the political and social mainstream. And even when we think they are misguided and wrong. So I love all that.
Right.
We can disagree vociferously with Peter Singer and yet learn a lot from him. He would be fools to not want to hear from him and read his work. The same cannot be said for Richard Spencer. That doesn't mean, it's not from your book, this is from an interview.
Yeah.
Sorry. That doesn't mean that Spencer should be specifically prohibited from speaking on campus. Here it is. But I don't see any reason why we should be inviting him to speak on a college campus. So I've already given you one critique of that, and you've given your rebuttal. Here's another critique.
Sure.
I think the same exact thing was said about abolitionists, suffragists,
No, totally right.
socialists, and now conservatives and libertarians.
No, I think that's right. I mean, that's always the danger, right? I mean, and one of the reasons why I think we ought to be extraordinarily cautious about this kind of line drawing exercise and the exclusion of people, because what you want universities to be are places where you can talk about things that are outside the mainstream now. And some of those things that are outside the mainstream now, in fact, are going to be very successful in the long run and are going to become the abolitionist movements, the the feminist movements and the like of their day, right? And it's hard to know in the moment which ones those are going to be, right? And so and that's not to say, therefore, the goal is always just to be on the right side of history. So make sure you invite the abolitionists in. The point is that you don't know for sure what ideas are going to wind up being influential, which ideas are going to turn out in hindsight to seem right. And so you want to keep yourself open to those new experiences and those new ideas and to talk them through, because things that you might on first impression think are not only extreme but useless, might in fact be extremely interesting and important. And it's a common experience for me, certainly, and including working on this book, right? Their ideas, when I first encounter them, I often think, oh, that sounds dumb, right? Why would anyone think that? And then the more you explore them, you realize, well, no, actually, there are important ideas there. There are important issues there, and they have to be unpacked, and they're complicated. And I may still not come to agree with the strongest advocates of them, but it turns out they're much more complicated than I thought on first impression. And I tend to think that's true of almost everything I've ever done. When on first impression, you have some initial thought of, well, that's obviously right, or that's obviously crazy. And then you start looking at it, and it's often more complicated. And I revel in the complication. And universities ought to be places where you can bring people in and hear ideas. And you may think on first impression, that's crazy. And the challenge is, can you get past that to think about, well, how is it complicated? Right. How is it interesting? What can you take away from this? And you can often be taken by surprise about where those interesting things are going to come from. And so you should be really, really cautious about trying to draw the boundaries too narrowly. So one thing I think is important about universities and attractive about universities is that you don't want a highly centralized system of inviting speakers to campus, for example, right? So if the only person authorized to invite a speaker to campus is the political science department or some dean of campus life, they're going to bring in a narrow set of people that they find interesting and valuable, but it's going to include all kinds of other people. So one thing that's nice about universities is we have an ecology in which lots of people are authorized to bring people to campus. Student groups are authorized to bring people to campus, and they bring all kinds of people to campus, right? And from my perspective, a lot of those people might be nutballs that you're not going to learn anything from. And I may be scratching my head saying, why do you find that worth talking about? But the students find it fascinating, and you want an environment in which that can happen, right? Including people are going to make mistakes in doing that, right? So they're going to bring somebody to campus, and it's going to turn out, well, that was a missed opportunity because nothing interesting happened there. Whether because it was a bad day or because it turns out that speaker actually just isn't very interesting, or they're interested in something else rather than bringing some interesting ideas to the table. But we would lose something tremendous if we started saying, okay, well, let's centralize this process so that the college Republicans, for example, can't make their own decisions about who to bring to campus. Instead, they got to get the sign off from the faculty of the political science department, because that's going to be a much more boring enterprise if we do that. And so my concern with toleration, I think, is toleration is got to be like the baseline, right? At least you want to be able to convince people that, look, these people that you find very disconcerting and disagreeable and maybe even dangerous, nonetheless, you should tolerate them being around. You should tolerate them having speech. You should tolerate them being able to engage in their own activities. But moreover, and Mill would have advocated this as well, moreover, you ought to do better than toleration, because you ought to try to talk to those people and engage them, because you will learn something from that. And part of what Mill was pressing us to do, and I think it's still the right instinct, is to say that you have lost something intellectually if you close yourselves off from having those conversations.
That's my
so
point.
you ought to be seeking out people that you find disagreeable in various ways.
If you claim to be an intellectual.
If you
that's
claim,
it.
Well,
to me,
I think if you claim to be an intellectual, that's certainly true. But I think if you want to take ideas seriously, that's true.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the threats on college campuses is there's a lot of people running around on college campuses now who don't think being intellectual and don't think taking ideas seriously is in fact the highest priority. Instead, they think, well, no, the highest priority is advancing my particular political agenda, for example. And if that's your highest priority, then it may make sense to say, and so therefore, let's suppress everybody that's getting in the way of my political agenda. And so let's close down the barriers on what kinds of ideas ought to be on campus. And if that's what campuses become, then not only not going to be very interesting places, but they're not going to be very useful places for society as a whole. And so I think we really want to push back against that strain of thought within academia today and say, no, look, academia's got to be a forum in which lots of different people can come in and say interesting things and you engage them.
But don't you think everybody's pushing a political agenda?
So to some degree, yes. I mean, right, so everything is somewhat connected to an agenda, although it can be more or less tightly connected to that agenda, right? And so,
yes.
So one of the things I frequently found myself frustrated by as I was writing the book is to say, so in response to sometimes students, but often faculty who find themselves in the middle of these controversies about speakers coming to campus, and they say things like, well, we, the committee of concerned faculty, ought to be the ones who have to sign off on any speaker coming to campus because we ought to be able to judge them. And part of that instinct is because they think they have good judgment, right? And so they think, well, look, I have good judgment. I will keep out the riffraff and bring in the good people, and we'll be much better off. And part of what I want to say to them is, well, look, so you think that's a great idea as long as you're the one doing the signing off. You will think it's a much less good idea if I'm the one doing the signing off. And the problem with really laying that down rhetorically is the problem is I'll sign off on anything. So really you want the much less tolerant version of me, right? You want the version of me that says, no, only the people who agree with me get to come in.
Right.
And you will quickly find you don't like that. And moreover, you will think it will lead to worse results, a less productive enterprise for the community as a whole if I had that kind of sensorial power. And the same thing is true for them.
Right. So, but they would say to you, and I would say to you, toleration is a political agenda.
It is at one level. I think that's right.
What,
I mean,
you're pushing a political agenda.
It is.
I mean this. I happen to like it better than theirs, but first of all, I don't love it, as I've made clear, but I certainly like it better than theirs. But also, it's just a political agenda. I do think, however, that there are degrees of this, or I would say that there are people who have a political agenda and are putting forth one. I think everyone does, but there are some who are, in doing so, are more open to and more honest about their opponents, right? And willing to, like Glenn Lowry is a great example of this, right? He's almost famous for this. You know, the steel man. He'd steel man's arguments rather than straw man them. And it's totally true. He's so good at inhabiting the mind of his intellectual or ideological opponents. He's so good at it, you sort of, for a moment, think, oh my God, is Glenn Lowry just changed his mind about these things? And now is he a neocon, or is he a socialist or something? And I try to do that too in my own teaching, and I think I'm pretty good at it. But you know, even there, I mean, Glenn Lowry's always pushing a particular political agenda. He says, you know, he wouldn't deny that. So yeah, I guess I don't think there's any such thing as sort of, well, you know, the truth-seeking mission. I think it doesn't have a lot of meaning for me.
Yeah, so I think you're right. That it's everything is connected to some set of political sensibilities and political understandings, and part of what I find attractive about the liberal tradition is it's a particularly expansive one, right? And so one way of saying, well, so the narrower way of talking about this is say, well, everything's political, you're political too, and the conclusion therefore is you will only bring in speakers of X type that agree with you about everything, right? And part of what the commitment of liberalism is to say, no, we're not going to bring in only speakers of X type. We're going to bring in speakers of all kinds of types, including people that we dramatically disagree with. But it is a political commitment that says it would be useful to have a society such that we can do that. And other people have a political commitment and say, no, it'd be much more useful to have a political society that doesn't do that. Instead, it's very restrictive and only the right kind of people get to talk and get to exercise power, and the wrong kind of people don't get to talk and don't get to exercise power. And so it is connected at one level to a vision of society, to a vision of a polity and how it works. And it's in one place, as I said at the beginning, right, that you can get off the bus of this argument in lots of places. And one of the places you can get off that bus is to say, look, I just don't buy liberalism, right? I'd much rather have a different kind of much more closed society that doesn't expose itself to
which is most of the left and most conservatives.
So certainly part of what I worry about today is that there are much bigger swaths of the American population than I would hope who do not find the liberal vision attractive and instead are find other much more restrictive visions attractive.
I'm actually truly amazed that the First Amendment still exists, because I don't see a constituency for it in the population at large. I don't see it among the political class. I don't see it in the intellectual class. Certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, but really never have I seen in American political discourse, intellectual discourse, what would look like a majority of free speech advocates. I don't, and certainly these days, the numbers are not good at all. And the discourse we're hearing is terrible. It's amazing to me that we still have the thing.
Yeah, so I would make 2 points about this. So one is that I have the same concern. It's one reason why I wanted to write the book, is that I think we're in a battle for these ideas and what's going to govern the future, and it's important for those of us who are committed to a more liberal vision of society be trying to defend that and articulate that and try to persuade people that's an attractive vision. They ought to adopt it as their own because we could easily go a different direction. And ultimately that would affect constitutional law as well, right? So constitutional law is ultimately going to be affected by what become dominant beliefs. And so it may well be true we're not going to repeal the First Amendment, but we may reinterpret the First Amendment such that it means something dramatically different than what we take it to mean today. And that battle for protecting a current relatively robust set of protections for free speech has to start now. Otherwise, you're going to lose it down the road. The other point, though, to make about this in general is free speech has always been hard. It's not the only thing that's hard, but civil liberties in general tend to be hard. So it's as long as we've been doing social science surveys, for example, the American population, we've been asking questions with variations on how do you feel about tolerating people you disagree with? How do you feel about free speech and those kind of things? And Americans have tended to say that they value free speech, they value tolerating different ideas. And then if you start asking them about specific ideas, specific speakers, specific people, then they quickly start qualifying it. And say, not that person goes too far. Not those ideas are off the table. And so it's hard in practice to actually implement a commitment to free speech, even if you think it's the right principle in general. And that's not just a challenge. And so sometimes we deride current students as being snowflakes who can't handle diversity and free speech and hard ideas. And they're no different than everyone that came before them. Americans have always struggled with that. So
to qualify your commitment to free speech, right? By saying, oh, I'm committed to free speech, except Richard Spencer should not be allowed to speak. Or, and everybody has, you said most people have qualifications. So I'm still amazed, right? I remain amazed that we have a First Amendment in its current form. I think,
it's hard to maintain.
I think the protection of speech is, well, clearly it's better in this country than anywhere else in the world. There's no doubt about that. There's no question. From your perspective, from my perspective, from Mill's perspective. Why though?
But as you noted,
do you have an analysis for that? Like why we have that still to this day, why it's still as robust as it is?
So,
because I can't explain it.
So I don't think there's a single easy explanation. I do think it's a variety of factors, and some of which are pretty accidental and not necessarily stable, right? And so I think our institutional arrangements help. So having a First Amendment in the text of the Constitution that can be enforced by courts, having relatively insulated courts that are capable of protecting that helps. And so when politicians get all excited about flag burning, for example, you can have relatively insulated judges who can say, flag burning is a protected form of free expression. And if you just left it up to elected legislatures, you would lose that, right? And so having that kind of insulation in an institution like courts can be helpful for sustaining that. There are important cultural foundations for sustaining that. So we have spent a lot of effort over the course of the 20th century trying to convince Americans they ought to value free speech and they ought to tolerate diversity and they ought to tolerate disagreeable ideas. And that's mixed and that's met with somewhat
when
mixed success.
When you say we, you mean classical liberals?
Well, I mean, we is a sort of, I think in this context, I mean, sort of we meaning sort of cultural leaders in American society. So if you look across from sort of early in the 20th century forward, right, that you have public intellectuals, but also increasingly government officials, college educated, newspaper editors and others, right, who are increasingly trying to impress upon Americans the importance of toleration of diversity and the importance of free speech and the importance of civil liberties, and that was resisting important strands of past American political thought that said, well, yeah, free speech is sort of important, but there are all kinds of other things that are a lot more important than free speech. And moreover, what we mean by free speech is really this very narrow thing, right? And so there's lots of people who contributed to that project across the 20th century, including radical dissidents and bohemian artists, pornographers, who are all sort of pushing on these kind of ideas of saying, no, let's expand what kinds of protections we would have. And I think we're at this sort of cultural moment where we are rethinking some of that, right? And instead there's a sense of, well, maybe we've gone too far, maybe we need to try to pull back in various kinds of ways. And there have often been pressures to pull back, but it was a long, hard struggle. So as you say, in the 1950s, for example, universities in particular were busily trying to push the socialists and the communists out of the faculty ranks. But likewise, if you look at the state of constitutional law in the 1950s, it was not very protective of free speech in the same way it is protective now, right? So it wasn't that long ago that if you were to ask a well-trained American judge, even a fairly liberal-minded American judge, about what is the scope of free speech, they would have told you something that's much more restrictive than what we now take for granted as being protections for free speech. And it was a struggle to overcome that and expand that notion such that even conservative judges now have a pretty deep commitment to free speech in a pretty expansive way, let alone sort of liberal judges. And now you worry a little bit that even some of that's going to flip, right? So the fact that you now have liberal justices on the court talking about weaponizing the First Amendment is kind of remarkable and frustrating about where the future might lie.
Yeah, so I think,
right, because liberal justices in the 60s and 70s were exactly, it was the conservative justices who would have said in the 60s and 70s, those liberals are weaponizing free speech, right? Yeah. And now we're on the flip side of that.
My take on the sort of so-called free speech absolutists, or people who have been identified as great defenders of free speech, is that those have been the ones who have been most comfortable and protected and secure in our society. So if you're a professor at Princeton or Columbia or any of those places, pretty much anywhere in the 20th century, in the 21st century, you're pretty safe. And so it's easy to be tolerant of diversity and dissent.
So I'd want to bracket a little bit.
Just so people know, your face got very sour.
Yeah, I know.
When I said that.
So I want to bracket a little bit the notion of free speech absolutists, because it's not clear to me that there are very many people who are really free speech.
Well, I mean just sort of free speech.
But
proponents.
people sort of very expansive notions of free speech, right? And I think you're right, certainly, that some of those that are advocating that and have advocated over time are elites in various ways.
Yeah, like John Stuart Mill was never going to get taken down to the town square by people with torches and pitchforks and hung by his neck for anything. He was in pretty safe space, wasn't he?
And I don't know actually if he was in that safe of a space. Really? He, like I said, he was sort of a countercultural figure in lots of ways in England at the time, but you're right. I mean, it was certainly sort of it's been the educated and socioeconomic elite over the course of the 20th century who tended to be most supportive of expansive free speech protections.
Yeah, right. And it's an elite idea.
It was an elite idea oftentimes, but the people who often grabbed hold of it and pushed those boundaries were often people very much on the margins, right? So it's the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s that are dramatically pushing the boundaries of what free speech protections look like. It's the socialists and anarchists in the early 20th century. They're dramatically pushing the boundaries of free speech. At that point, right? I mean, so it's often people. It's photographers like Larry Flint who are pushing this, right? And so,
however, generally speaking, so that's what I write about, in fact, is those people on the margins who basically change the mainstream. Now, generally speaking, and this includes...
But they do it by allying with people in the elites.
But mostly they do it simply by speaking, rather than making an argument that they should be allowed to speak.
It's a little of both, right? I mean, so there are, for example, anarchists and socialists who were writing in the early 20th century about the importance of free speech, as well as writing about other kinds of stuff. And they're very skeptical about the willingness of the state to actually respect it.
But communists certainly were not, though, right? And they were the ones who were the victims of speech, of free speech laws.
Well, I'm thinking it's sort of around like the turn of the 20th century, so like 1900, when you have these revolutionary anarchists who are getting rounded up.
But they're not making Mill's argument.
No, they're making slightly different arguments.
Very different arguments.
Yeah. No, that's right. They're resting on different foundations than Mill does. That's right. And so there are interesting differences. But part of their argument, though, is a coalitional argument. So part of their argument is, and it's part of the foundation of the American Civil Liberties Union, right? Which starts off as an organization of socialists and communists, right? Who are founding this organization because they're mostly people resisting the drafts in World War I, right? And so the reason why they want to emphasize free speech is to say, look, we want to emphasize free speech for us. And in order to get that, we want to emphasize free speech for you. And we're going to build that coalition brick by saying, let's protect both the guys we disagree with, and because then hopefully we can also protect ourselves.
So with the communists, it's at least opportunism, right?
Yeah, for sure.
They're clearly not committed to free speech,
totally right?
So you're right. They allied themselves with liberals in the middle of the 20th century. They founded the ACLU with liberals. They've done a bunch of stuff with liberals, or at least in the middle of the 20th century, to protect their own asses, right?
Right.
But obviously they were allied with Joseph Stalin, so they're not pro free speech, they're lying essentially, but.
No, but that's partially how politics works, right? I mean, that you can get a lot of leverage out of people having to make coalitions they're not very happy with and compromises they aren't very happy with. And so as we said, why has the First Amendment survived all this time, right? One of the things that I think helps do that is the fact that we have lots of real disagreements in society, right? And so if instead we had a very homogeneous society in which there weren't lots of disagreements, everyone was basically on the same page, there'd be a lot more agreement about the idea, well, let's quash the dissenters then. And across American history, that was often true, right? When we looked around and said, well, look, there's just this radical over here who wants to say crazy stuff. That's not free speech. And so let's quash them. And so part of what sustains free speech and made it more robust in the 20th century is increasing diversity of the society and culture itself, in which there were more and more people who thought, I better go coalesce with some other people that care about free speech stuff, because I could find myself on the wrong end of the baton.
That's right.
And that's important, right? And so, because societies will start crushing down on these things when they think, well, look, all of us who are making the decisions are all in agreement here, and we all are pretty comfortable. And so, let's put our boot on the neck of the guy that we disagree with, right? And
I'm anti-communist, and I'm also anti-20th century liberal, but I'm really glad they coalesced around this to form the ACLU. I'm glad we have the ACLU. By the way, the ACLU is no longer really the ACLU. I don't know if you've been following this, but they're almost on the verge of just going over the cliff. I think.
That's been a perpetual struggle for the ACLU too, though. Across their history, they've had these periods where they've struggled with this, in part because they have this. They were born with this divided agenda.
This one's looking bad though, because it's the younger people, right?
No,
it's the future that are really not committed to free speech the way that we think about it.
No, it's very unfortunate that the ACLU. I mean, I'm happy for other organizations like FIRE, which I think does very good work in the educational domain and trying to do these traditional civil liberties protections. In a fairly open-ended way that I think are extraordinarily valuable. So I'm hopeful that people will pick up the slack from what ACLU's backing off of, but I do worry that the ACLU is a bellwether on this, and that it's an indication of that those of us who value civil liberties are losing the war of ideas and losing the hearts and minds of the next generation.
There you go.
That will think, well, look, the only people who could possibly care about free speech are the Nazis, right? And it's like, well, that's a weird thing to say, because through most of American history, it's been the abolitionists, it's been the anarchists, it's been the civil rights leaders who desperately needed free speech and needed free speech protections. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. That will be true in the future as well.
So is it fair to say that your book is in large part a warning to your colleagues to essentially shape up on this question, or they might end up losing?
It is. I think that's right.
Yes.
I think moreover that there are a lot of faculty who have had a bit of a wake up call on this front over the last few years. There, people are, and I, in some ways, I was among them, right? So a lot of the work I do more generally is on structural features of constitutional law. I've been interested in presidential power and federalism and other kinds of things. I wasn't writing about free speech particularly, in part because I took free speech for granted, right? A lot of victories have been won. We seemed like we were in a good place from a constitutional law perspective, and part of what motivated me to want to write this book and write it for a broader audience is precisely this sense of those things I thought were battles that had been won, things I was taking for granted, I think now are in play. And there's going to be a struggle and you could lose. And so I think faculty need a wake-up call to think hard about what values they really care about and what they ought to defend. And moreover, we need to be trying to educate students so that they hopefully are persuaded by the ideas, but at least they understand the ideas so that they can think about, look, here's the case for free speech. And part of what I find troubling with the current generation of students is not that they have thought about this carefully and rejected it, is that they haven't been exposed to the ideas hard enough to even think about it very hard, right? They've just rejected it without thinking about it. And I certainly hope that at the end of the day, they can be persuaded and come around to what I think are the better set of ideas. But at the very least, they need to be exposed to what the potential virtues are here, what are the values here, what are the concerns here, what are the trade-offs here as we think about restricting free speech and civil liberties. And so, we need to be engaged in that conversation.
Yeah, so one of the things that's exciting to me about your book is that it's been assigned by the president of Princeton, correct?
Yep.
As the mandatory freshman reading? Or?
Yes. So we'll see how many of the freshmen actually read it, but they have all been given a copy and told they're supposed to read it. Moreover, actually, I have to say that the President Eisgruber, who assigned this in part because he's, I think, very invested in these issues of free speech and intellectual diversity on campus as well. And he departed from his normal approach to thinking about these freshman pre-reads of not only giving it to the incoming freshmen, but he's giving a copy to all the students on campus already, as well as all the faculty on campus, and is making it available to the staff on campus as well. So, he is trying to send a message that this is an important part of what the values of our university community are, and we ought to at least understand them and grapple with them, even if we don't necessarily embrace them.
So he's worried. He sees a threat.
I think that's right.
The president of the University of Chicago sees a threat. He has made very similar statements, very strong statements. I think the president of Ohio State has also, is this right? I think
there's been several presidents who
are leading the way on this.
There are some university presidents who are leading the way. I think there are other university presidents who are keeping their heads down, and they're very nervous about speaking out on this. I think it's important, though, for university presidents to speak out on it, in part because it sends a message, for example, to staff on campus and administrators on campus about where the values are on campus and what they ought to do. I think it's also important, though, for faculty to speak up about this. So the University of Chicago faculty adopted a statement of free speech principles a few years ago. Princeton faculty was the second one to adopt that same statement to reinforce that message. Some other faculties at other campuses have adopted that statement as well subsequently. So I think this is a conversation that all of us on college campuses, but certainly, I think more generally, all of us who care about college campuses ought to be engaged in, and because I think things are in play.
So I would imagine you're excited about your book being assigned as the freshman reading for a few reasons, right? But one of them, I'm sure, and maybe the big reason, is that it's a serious call for the kind of reform you want, right? For me, I'm excited about it for a different reason, which is that it tells me the enemy feels threatened.
Yeah.
Right. Because here's the thing about college presidents that a lot of people don't know. They are academics. Pretty much all college and university presidents are academics. But right now, in their current position, they are businessmen.
Right.
Who are accountants, who have to care about the bottom line. And enrollments almost across the board are down. Right. You know about this, right? So the Catholic University where you used to teach has laid off tenured faculty. Willamette University, which I know a lot about, obviously, their incoming class is like 40% less than it was last year. And I'm hearing reports that this is across the board in all colleges and universities. Now, there are multiple causes of that. And I'm sure that the decline of, adherence to free speech principles is probably a minor one. But But it does tell me that somebody who's minding the store does see the threat outside, maybe, I hope. And so that gives me hope for the future.
I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a growing sense that they're about concerns on campus itself, and sort of how are things changing. And so I think some university presidents, as well as faculty and others, have come to realize that a set of commitments and values that they care about may not endure very long if they don't get out there and try to defend them and advocate for them. But I think it's also this concern about we need to be persuading people outside universities that universities matter, that they're valuable, that we need to be persuading potential students and their parents that it's worth sending kids to college. We need to be able to persuade donors and state legislators that it's worth protecting colleges and funding colleges. And I think that the best case for doing that is going to be one that's grounded in the idea that universities are valuable in part because they are truth-seeking missions that are politically neutral, that are open to wide ranges of ideas, and they're not just political instruments of the left. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, for example, a lot of conservatives outside of academia are deeply concerned that universities are really just tools of the left, and so why shouldn't we break them up as much as possible? And I think that's a tremendous threat to universities if that's the case, and if they get perceived that way. I think there's also other kinds of concerns about universities. They're too expensive. They aren't training students adequately for careers in the modern economy. And those require different kinds of approaches to try to address. But I think part of the concern is if you think universities are indoctrination factories, then you're going to feel like maybe I don't want to go there. And my stake in their success is pretty limited. And so the consequence, I think universities have a real stake in not becoming indoctrination factories.
My final question. Yeah. You ready for a curveball?
Sure.
Do you know who Joe Rogan is?
Yeah.
How many of your faculty know who Joe Rogan is, do you think?
That's a good question, because I am sure that my colleagues don't know that I know who Joe Rogan is. Yeah. And I know Joe Rogan in part because I actually follow mixed martial arts. And so
do you really?
I do.
Keith Whittington, you didn't tell me this.
Yes,
We've been here for 2 hours.
I know, right.
I train in Muay Thai and boxing.
No,
yeah.
I know.
And I'm a huge fan. Yeah.
Right,
okay.
Yeah. So which is why
that's a real anomaly. Although
that's a very big anomaly. That's
I actually know, shout out to Rob Gressis, I think your name is pronounced, a fan of this show who's I'm sure listening, will be listening, who's he's the only other faculty I've ever met who's Shane Lee, also another guy who's been on the show, sociologist at the University of Houston, who I just interviewed. The four of us are the only faculty I know who are true fans.
Yeah. So my first exposure to Joe Rogan was through the UFC, but subsequently then, of course, know more about
every faculty member, every administrator, certainly in this country, should be studying the Joe Rogan podcast, not for its not for the MMA coverage on it, but because he's not leading the revolution because he doesn't care, but there's a revolution going on that he's sort of at the head of millions of people who are very, very smart, very educated in their own ways, who give no fucks about Princeton or any of this stuff, and are essentially establishing a massive alternative higher education ecosystem that's completely outside those institutions. Yeah. And that is the threat. So I almost feel sorry for people who are not aware of this, who are, who might end up losing their jobs because of that, like because of Joe Rogan, like really. People I think are actually choosing not to go to college because they say, I've heard this hundreds of times, because there's a Joe Rogan podcast, because there's a Thaddeus Russell podcast, because there's Renegade University, because there's the Sam Harris podcast. I hate to give a shout out, but it's true. I hate him, but it's true. Yeah. He's educating a lot of people. And he's educated me. Like even guys I can't stand like him, I learn a ton because I don't know stuff about science and neuroscience, and I learn a lot.
So I think it's part of the challenges universities face.
Isn't that funny though? Like
confronting that marketplace
of all people in the whole world, right? 20 years ago, when the UFC was starting and he was the color commentator for the UFC, and you and I were sitting there watching the fights.
This guy,
I said, Keith, you know what? This guy, he's going to have millions of followers, and he's going to be taking down the higher education system.
Yeah.
So now, what are you talking about?
Right. So not only sort of that individual person, but also the technology of podcasts and how they caught on. I mean, it's no, that's right. There's lots of things like that, And universities cannot be complacent, because I think you're right that it's easy to imagine these kind of institutions are permanent and not going anywhere, and that's just not true. They could go flat if people don't want to continue to support them, and that was the struggle that a lot of these older institutions went through at the end of the 19th century, when the modern industrial economy was forming, and lots of people in that economy, the economic elites of that period, were looking at universities and saying, what are you contributing to me? Why should I send my kid to Princeton University to waste 4 years of his time, and I could just send him right into the steelworks and he could start making money? And universities had to change in response to that in order to try to say, no, we can actually add value here and do something that would be useful and would make it worth their while to take 4 years of your life to go to universities. And I think we're confronting a bit of that today as well, that we have to make the case as to why is it worth your while, or your dollars if you're a donor and the like, or why is it worth your while to support these kind of institutions or to spend time in these kind of institutions, given that there's all kinds of information and other kinds of things at your fingertips in other places. You can't take for granted that people are going to come to places like universities. Yeah.
Professor Keith Whittington, thank you for doing this. I want to say this. Everyone who's listening should read your book. It's called, and I mean this, I've never said this before. I haven't. It's called Speak Freely. And I want everyone to read it because it is as good and as clear an explication and presentation of this very important line of thought. And having listened to us talking for 2 hours about it, I think it will be an incredibly rewarding experience no matter which side you take on this. If you don't like million tolerance or you love it, and if you're committed to free speech or not, I think that it's going to be one of the most rewarding intellectual experiences you might have. I really mean that.
I appreciate it. And I hope people do read it. Obviously, it's why, sometimes you write things because you just want to get the argument right. And publishing it is sort of an afterthought. And this is something that, the whole point of writing it is to try to get people to read it. And I'm used to people not agreeing with me, so I'm sure some people will read it and then not be persuaded by it. But I hope they nonetheless find it useful for thinking more carefully about these ideas, even if at the end of the day they come to different conclusions than I do about them.
And next time you're on, we're going to talk only about the UFC.
It's all about UFC.
I'm going to do a whole new podcast. It's going to be professors talking about fighters.
That would be a very short-lived podcast.
We'll see. I don't know. I'm going to make it work. I think it's going to work. I think it's going to be fascinating. Anyway, thank you very much for doing this.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
And thanks for driving all the way out here. It's a really, truly a great honor to have a Princeton professor drive from Princeton all the way to Brooklyn to talk to me. So again,
I think it's the first time I've ever set foot in Brooklyn. So.
Oh, really?
So yeah,
that's great. Awesome. This is it. I put it on my gravestone.
There you go.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
This was the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredunderground.com. To get information and to buy tickets to the Renegade University weekend events in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., go to thaddeusrussell.com/courses. Thanks for listening.